It is a huge pleasure to have Laura Dee here with us. Laura's from the University of Colorado, and before that, University of Minnesota. Laura received her PhD in environmental science and management from UC Santa Barbara, where, and this is how you know she's way smarter than I am, she completed a degree in economics simultaneously. So she did 2 degrees at the same time from Santa Barbara. And her work there was really interesting. It focused on the impacts of temperature variability on biodiversity in fisheries, and then looked at that and really sort of asked a question around, if we manage natural resources in the face of temperature variability for ecosystem services, does this then provide the economic incentive for conservation? And I think it's really interesting, and it's like a foundational question that we all deal with, I think. What was then interesting was she moved to Minnesota for a postdoc, and like all smart people, she moved from fish to forest, and then almost a similar question, slight nuance, but asked how climate change and extreme disturbance impacts forests and the ecosystem services they provide. So it was an interesting twist on the theme. And then if you kind of look at sort of the body of her work, you'll see that she combines global change ecology, community ecology, ecosystem ecology, conservation science, and she uses quantitative tools that come from a variety of disciplines. And she works across scales and lots of different ecosystem types, forests and fisheries I mentioned, but also coastal ecosystems and grasslands. And I think what's so cool is that Laura has both the interest and the ability to kind of work across systems and take lessons from one system and apply them to another. And when she does that, I think over and over, at least my take of Laura's work is she's generating innovative ideas about how to adapt conservation in response to global change occurring in different systems. So super excited that she's here, really excited to hear what she has to say. I also would say that the title of her talk, Quantifying How Global Change Impacts Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, is the best talk title ever that matches a person's bio. It doesn't get any better. So anyways, welcome to Laura, and thanks again for being here.
Thanks to Phil and Phil's lab for inviting me. Yeah, I might have pulled the title from my bio in a last minute panic. Anyway, I really wish I could be there in person, and I've been following a lot of the exciting research going on in your program. And this is sort of summing up my recent seminars and teaching. So I'd like to just put a plug that I'd love to reach out and meet with any of you too following the talk if you see some common interests. So today I'm going to talk to you about the work that my lab is doing on trying to quantify and understand how global change is altering ecosystems and what those consequences are for people. And when I talk about global change, I'm talking about things like land use change, climate change, and extreme disturbances, all the way to overharvesting of species and invasion. And my overarching question for this talk, and a big focus of my research, is how we can maintain ecosystem services in the face of global change. And by ecosystem services, I mean the contributions of nature to human well-being. And these can be services that are of direct market value, like timber or fish for food production, all the way to things like pollination of crops, shoreline protection, and then also the intrinsic value of biodiversity itself. And we know that people depend on ecosystems for many dimensions of human well-being, and we know that global change is going to dramatically alter ecosystems, yet there's still a lot we don't know about how global change is going to affect ecosystem services. And I'm going to talk about 2 key gaps and challenges. So the first challenge is that while we've made a lot of progress in understanding ecosystem services and quantifying them on the landscape, the focus of most studies have been where ecosystem services are. So taking these land cover maps and associating an average value of an ecosystem service to a land cover type. And that's been really improving our understanding of how ecosystem services are changing as we modify our land use, but it typically relies on average and static conditions. So this provides a limited understanding into how ecosystem services are going to change through time, including in response to a diversity of global change drivers beyond average conditions, and in response to certain policy changes. At the same time, in ecology, we have a growing knowledge about the impacts of global change through experimental work and retrospective analyses and lab experiments, for instance, where we might add nitrogen or carbon dioxide to see how ecosystems are responding to those changes, or experimental temperature warming. But a lot of those studies actually stop at the impacts to species and ecosystems and don't go that extra step to quantify the connections for how those changes in the ecosystem might also lead to a change in human well-being or ecosystem services. So the first part of my talk is going to ask, how well do changes in ecological communities map on or predict changes in these ecosystem services? Because if there is a tight connection between these changes in ecological communities that people are documenting around the world in different systems in response to different drivers, that could provide a lot of insight into potential threats or changes in ecosystem services that we might expect. But on the other hand, these are not really necessarily the same outcomes. So there's a lot of questions there about the extent to which one explains the other. Then, if we can actually anticipate how species and ecosystems and services are going to change, the second question is, what can we do about it? So how can we best moderate the impacts to ecosystem services through our management decisions? So for example, here's a case where we could be making decisions about restoration or protecting a grassland or prairie next to an agricultural field, which then would feed back to affect the ecological community, the pollinators there, and then could actually change the services that people are receiving. So in this way, just this example, our conservation and management decisions can actually mediate the effects of global change on ecosystem services. So the first part of the talk, I'm going to focus on two different types of disturbance impacts and try to understand the extent to which changes in ecosystems predict changes in ecosystem services. And I'm going to do this with two systems. The first is considering extreme windstorms in forests, and the second is species losses in coastal food webs. So the first global change driver I'm going to be talking about are extreme disturbances. And my motivation and interest for studying the impacts of disturbances in the context of global change is that climate change is not only changing the average conditions, but also making disturbances more extreme and more frequent. For instance, these mega fires in California and Colorado, major drought events, and heat waves. And while many ecosystems have been historically adapted to disturbances like boreal forests and deserts, we're now under climate change pushing the disturbance intensities outside of the historical range. So these more intense events are becoming more intense and more frequent. And we also have increasing uncertainty over which disturbance events are going to actually occur. So the first research question for this is examining how these shifts in disturbance regimes are going to be impacting ecosystems and their services, and whether these changes that we anticipate for ecological communities predict the consequences for ecosystem services in the northern boreal forest in Minnesota. So here I'm looking at timber and biomass of forests. And this is a really tough question to answer because disturbances are often uncertain and stochastic in nature. So it's really hard to anticipate when, where, or how intensely they will occur, even without climate change complicating matters. So I've been tackling this problem with an interdisciplinary group of ecosystem and community ecologists, economists, and mathematicians. And a key contribution of our work is considering that disturbances are uncertain and that they're shifting towards these more extreme scenarios under climate change. And so to provide some background on why this is potentially an important contribution, I'll review how this builds on some existing work in ecology. So in ecology, there's many studies after a disturbance happens. So a retrospective analysis where you observe a disturbance of a particular intensity, or experiments where you might apply a treatment of a particular disturbance intensity or two, or process-based models that are deterministic. For example, you could view this looking at this graph that there's a scenario in an experiment where you implement an intensity of the blue disturbance or the gray. So you could in that way compare the impacts of different disturbance intensities, but that also just leaves a little bit that we don't know. So for instance, say that you have these two scenarios, how frequently do you think each are going to occur? And that's going to actually change our predictions about the outcomes. So what's missing here is that we actually might have a distribution of potential disturbances and we don't know which are going to happen. In the ecosystem services world, most studies actually ignore disturbances and consider average conditions. And in this project, we're going to model a set of possible disturbances that have a particular probability of occurring. So this allows us to consider a distribution of possible futures, with some more likely than others. So in particular, we formulate the following general idea in a mathematical framework, where we have a set of potential disturbances of intensities. That regime could actually be shifting under climate change. And then we model how that disturbance, here in the case of the boreal forest, wind disturbances, will impact the ecological community, what that means for ecosystem services, and then what that means to the benefit or value to people, and how that could be moderated by things like market changes or policy change. And a key part of this framework is that we use species functional traits or their characteristics, which can help us predict the response of particular species to a given disturbance and the effect of particular species on an ecosystem service. So to provide a concrete example of how traits can help, the consequences of a disturbance event can depend on and differ across species, because species, for instance, based on their size, might have a different response to these wind events. So you can see here that some trees have died in response to this disturbance, some are still standing, and species can also differ in their effects on different ecosystem processes, or in our case, they contribute differently to timber markets and different timber products. So we use traits to try to tease apart these complexities of understanding the consequences of how different species might respond to disturbances and what this might mean for services. So to break this down through a more concrete application, I'm going to talk about severe windstorms in Minnesota forests. And we do this across this landscape for over 770 sites using forest inventory data. And each of these sites has different species in the community, and these species are different sizes. And we know that information from the forest inventory data. And here we focus on size as the trait because this trait predicts responses to windstorms, and it also is known to give indication of the contribution to above ground functions like the timber volume or biomass. So that's really the focal trait here. So what our framework does is takes each community for a particular disturbance intensity, and we then generate a new community based on known relationships between species traits and the probability of mortality for a given intensity. So here in this case, we have the size of the species, the probability of mortality, and you can see that it differs by species and it differs by size. So with that, we then can generate a new expected community for a particular disturbance intensity. And this is just an example of a single simulation run for a single community, but really we do this for 10,000 times for each community. So then we also have known relationships, like I said, but between the size of the tree, the species, and its biomass or volume in terms of marketable timber volume and products. So we can use these known empirical relationships to then generate expected service levels for different types of products, for different species, and for different counties that differ in their timber markets. So this is just an example of the entire workflow that the model does for a single run. And we do this over and over and over and over again using Monte Carlo simulations for a disturbance regime. So this is an example of what this process looks like, where we would grab disturbance intensity with a particular probability and run through that whole process. And we can do this for different disturbance regimes as well. So we can compare historical and current to one that might more reflect the future climate. And what this gives us is a distribution of potential future communities and potential future service levels, And with this output, we can compute various things, and we do. So an example is that we can look at the similarity of the tree community before and after the disturbance, given a regime of a particular probability distribution. We can also calculate the variance or the coefficient of variance or stability, as they call it in ecology, of the community after the disturbances. So how much is that community changing in terms of the variance after across all these intensities on average? And then finally, we can quantify different outcomes for ecosystem services, which is really the focus here. So we can look at things like the expected value or amount, the variance in that value, or how risky that service will be in the future, and then the fraction of the service remaining on average, which we call the functional resistance of the service. So it's a pretty flexible way to calculate various aspects of the system under the future disturbance regime, for instance. So just to show you some of the results, first we just look at the community similarity before and after, like I showed you. And this is a scenario here under the current disturbance regime, and moving to these darker colors is what these communities at the county level would look like under a future disturbance regime. And the main takeaway here, it's not really rocket science, but the more likely these intense storms are, the higher the community change is going to be under climate change. So just to get back to the main question, how do these community changes actually translate to ecosystem services, which is our focus? So I'm going to show you the fraction of the service remaining for a particular disturbance regime, just starting with the current one. And then here, rather than showing you things aggregated at the county level, like I did in the last plot, I'm going to show it for each forest location. And one of the key points of comparison here is that under a scenario of no disturbance, or sort of the status quo ecosystem service model, we would have a line here where there would be no change in the amount of service. But in reality, ecological measure of the change versus the ecosystem service change. So these red lines are showing below this gray line when the ecosystem service value is worse off than the biomass or volume of the tree community. So the losses, or the fraction of the service remaining, is actually lower than what you would anticipate with an ecological focus. And above the line is actually when the ecosystem service value is better off than the biomass or volume. So a big takeaway here is there's a lot of variation, but there's not a lot of points here that are actually one-to-one on this line. And a big part of this is because species can actually differ in their response to these disturbances, like we showed you with this little simple example of different trees being blown down or not. And they also differ in their contributions to the timber volume or biomass. And that differs across species and by timber products. So we can start to understand when and why we might expect this divergence from the ecological conclusions about community change and ecosystem service conclusions. So looking at this, we're trying out different visualizations to show this. So I'm going to show it to you in a different way as well. So how well do other measures of community change that are often used in ecology, like the coefficient of variation, compare to service measures? So here we look at the coefficient of variation, or stability of the community, and the expected value of the service, as well as the variance in the value. And we look at this under a few different scenarios. And the big takeaway is there's really not much correlation. There's very little correspondence here. And in our case study, this was actually very surprising because the biomass and volume of the trees are so related to what you can actually get for timber products. But really, there was very little relationship here. And we think that actually maybe there could be even less relationship, just hypothesizing, for other services that are much less tied to things like biomass of species. So that's something we're interested in exploring more for other systems and other services. So this first example looked at a single trophic level and type of species, which was trees. And next, I'm going to move to coastal ecosystems, where we can actually start to think about a food web context, where you have different trophic levels that are interacting in complex, interdependent ways. So the next part of this talk is going to ask, does considering species interactions in complex food webs change these conclusions? Or said another way, are ecological responses to disturbances going to be more aligned with ecosystem service responses when we take a more food web perspective and think that, ecosystems are made up of complex interactions among species. So here's an example of why this is an interesting but also hard problem. When species interact in these complex food webs, this is a much simplified one, threats to ecosystems are actually a lot harder to anticipate and manage. For instance, ocean acidification could be harming this bivalve species, which could then have cascading effects to the species that rely on that bivalve as prey. And that could actually then alter the species that are harvested for fisheries, or ones that are appreciated for other services like bird watching. But despite these connections, most ecosystem service assessments focus directly on species involved in services. So that could potentially miss these complicated indirect threats that could occur. So we're wondering, by taking a food web perspective, could we potentially reveal indirect threats to services or species that might be playing some indirect critical supporting role? And in particular, there's been a lot of work on food web ecology that's looking at the consequences of species losses for food webs and food web persistence. So are there lessons that we can learn from that field that can be applied to ecosystem services? That's sort of an untapped potential. So in order to address this problem, I led a working group several years ago at SDiv that began to address this challenge. And the approach that we took was to represent these complex systems and relationships using a network, where we have species in a food web, where the blue lines are representing feeding interactions between species, and then adding ecosystem services as nodes in that network, where you could then represent the dependencies of services on particular species directly, and then how they're really embedded in these food webs. So by doing this, we can then explore the consequences of species losses for ecosystem services using relatively simple representations of the network, or you could go to really complicated ones, but I'm going to show you how just simple representations like this might be informative. So in particular, we could imagine by taking a food web perspective, there could be different scenarios where you could have responses of ecosystem services be similar or not to the responses of food webs to species losses. And a network approach can help you visualize it. So in the first scenario, we could have a species that is lost that plays a really key role in the food web. So a lot of species eat it, but it doesn't really play an important role in the service. So the first scenario may be that there's large consequences of species loss for the food web persistence, but not for the ecosystem services. The next scenario is that there could be a species that plays an important role in providing services, but isn't really highly connected in the food web. So species that provide services could be lost, leading to larger consequences for services than for food web change. Then finally, there could be a scenario in which the species lost, such as important basal species, can have large consequences for the food web persistence as well as the services. And of course, the case where there could be species losses that affect neither. So by taking a network approach, we can begin to understand the indirect effects of species losses for ecosystem services, and then explore these different scenarios through modeling and using empirical data to understand when the responses of the food web will be similar to or decoupled from the responses of the services. So one way we do this is by considering robustness, which is a measure of the tolerance of food webs to species losses. And we can use these common tools from food web theory and network science to try to better understand the indirect threats to ecosystem services. And in our work, we extend robustness approaches to consider the tolerance of ecosystem services to species losses, not only for food web persistence. And in work led by my PhD student, Aislinn Keys, we ask how related is food web robustness and ecosystem service robustness, Or said another way, do the hundreds of studies on food web robustness potentially give us some really important insights on threats to ecosystem services? So to address this question, we add 7 ecosystem services as nodes in 3 coastal food webs of salt marshes. And these are services like carbon sequestration, bird watching, fisheries, water filtration, etc. And this forms a complex network where you have nodes that are services and nodes that are species, and the interactions between species and the contributions of species to services. By doing this and taking this network perspective, what's revealed is that most species play some role in at least one ecosystem service, either directly or indirectly through their role in the food web. So this suggests that there could be a tight relationship between the robustness of food webs and of ecosystem services, or that if you start losing species and the food web starts to unravel, that will also have consequences for services. To test this, we calculate the robustness of food webs and ecosystem services by simulating 12 sequences of species losses, where we will then remove species in different orders and then track the consequences. So for instance, we've done this with random species removals compared to species that are more vulnerable to particular threats like pollution or ocean acidification, or ordered in terms of their rarity. We then will track the secondary losses of species following the direct removal of a species and the secondary losses of services. And we can do this in each of the systems for each of the sequences of species loss. So with this approach, we then come back to the main question about whether the responses of food webs and of services are related and how that could vary across these 3 salt marsh systems and these 12 sequences of species losses. And here we have the measure of food web robustness or tolerance to species losses. So higher robustness values indicate greater tolerance, so more persistence of the food web. And then here we have the ecosystem service robustness. So again, higher values means less loss. So the key takeaway here is that across all of these different sequences and for each of these systems, the relationship between these 2 measures of tolerance to species loss is tight. It's very, very highly correlated. And this is true with all of these different scenarios. So this potentially suggests that the studies on food web robustness could have important implications for ecosystem services. And of course, this is something that's just based on modeling. So the next step with my collaborator in co-PI, Ali Barner at Colby College, is if we can ever leave the house with COVID, to test some of these predictions with experiments in the Gulf of Maine. And we're going to do this looking at the Gulf of Maine food web and function following the more recent decline of blue mussel, which was historically very abundant in the systems and an important basal species, but has been nearly locally extirpated in many places. So we're excited to test some of this and the predictions. Stay tuned. Another ongoing aspect of this is to integrate social and ecological networks to try to better understand how to manage ecosystem services given complex interactions in social ecological systems. So this is a succinct working group that happened not last September, but the one before, working with social scientists and ecologists, where we're connecting food web theory to the growing field of social network analysis in the context of environmental governance. For instance, we could consider a multi-layer network where species are interacting and people are interacting through collaboration, and those people are connected to the food web through harvest. So network analysis provides a flexible toolkit to build these collaborations across disciplines that we hope to use to better understand the responses of and management of ecosystem services across scales. So in conclusion from this first part of the talk, which really asks, do the responses of ecological communities predict ecosystem service change under these two different types of global change and two different systems? We found really different answers. So in the case of the forest responses to extreme wind events, we found very little relationship between community change, community stability, and any of the ecosystem service values, whether it was the expected amount, change, or variance in that value. And that was actually surprising for this case study. In the other case, when we started looking at a system through a food web lens, we did find that the responses of food webs and services we would predict through our models to be highly related. And we're next going to test some of those predictions more empirically. So maybe an unsatisfying answer, but no and yes. The next part of the talk is going to translate to management, or attempt to. So the next question is, given potential impacts of global change drivers to ecosystem services, what can we do about it in terms of our management decisions to best moderate impacts? And this is a hard challenge because resource management is often constrained by limited budgets, limited information, a lot of complexity, and a lot of different stakeholders. And in the remaining time, I'm going to walk through one example of how we're using tools from different fields applied to ecology and resource management. And in particular, I'm going to talk about near optimal invasive species management at a landscape scale for an aquatic invasive species in Minnesota, and how we're attempting to draw on principles from network science and epidemiology to manage invasive species spread to reduce landscape impacts on native ecosystems and ecosystem services. And this is characteristic of a lot of general management challenges for ecosystem services in large, complicated, highly dynamic, low information, high complexity systems. That's a lot of words, but it's characteristic. So invasive species are one of the top drivers of biodiversity loss following land use change and overharvest, and they cost billions of dollars in management and damages per year. They threaten food production and other ecosystem services, and they're becoming more prevalent around the world. I'm going to focus on a particularly problematic invasive species in the US, and that's the invasive zebra mussel in the Midwest. And particularly, as Phil said, I used to be based in Minnesota, so I'm going to talk about Minnesota as a case study because also of my close connections to working with managers there who are trying to face this problem. And zebra mussel is rapidly expanding in Minnesota, largely driven by spread by people, where different recreational boaters will go into an infested lake and get the zebra mussel larvae and then spread it to other lakes through overland movement. And so largely the spread is driven by people. You can see on this map, the blue dots are uninfested lakes, the red dots are infested lakes, and the blue lines are the movement between these lakes. So it's a really complicated system. One once the zebra mussels have established, they can have really large impacts on ecosystem services and native ecosystems. They can basically disrupt the food web, re-engineer ecosystems, including extirpating native mussel species, and they also affect recreation, property value, and fisheries, largely recreational here. And once these species establish, it's almost impossible to eradicate them. So in Minnesota, the main decision is how to best prevent further spread of these invasive species. And like I said, the way that people are doing this is to try to actually stop infested boats from entering uninfested lakes by using inspection stations and education programs. So they have about $10 million annually to allocate to the different counties, and then county level managers are deciding where they're going to put people to inspect the boats, where they then charge them a fee to try to deter this behavior and have people clean the boats. So the way that people are doing it now is to just say, okay, well, where's the biggest parking lots? Let's put the inspection station there. So we think with $10 million, we could potentially do better. So again, the question here is how to best manage this invasion with limited resources, given the real complexity of this system with over 1 million boaters, 10,000 lakes, 80 something different counties, and $10 million only to allocate towards management. So to do this, we've brought together a team of computational biologists led by Jamie Ashander, who's a postdoc on this project, as well as economists, invasive species experts, and experts in operations research. And together we're tackling this question of how to best manage the invasion. And given the lack of options for eradication, we're considering the management goal of preventing further spread. And in order to tackle this problem, given the complexity and information constraints, we think this is characteristic of a lot of invasive species and resource management problems, where our typical toolkit using tools from optimization, operations research may not be tractable. So we're going to try out a different approach, and we do. So we're asking, to what extent can network structure or the patterns of connectivity between the lakes be used to guide management? And how well does the network guided management rules or heuristics depend on the information levels? So can networks actually perform close to optimum? So we develop an approach that combines network and decision science, and it involves 4 steps. The first step is to construct a network. Here our network is on human boater movement, where we have lakes, and then those are the nodes, and the edges are directed movement of boaters between the lakes. So then we can identify the structure of the network or the patterns of the connectivity between the lakes. The next step is to use integer linear programming to calculate the optimal intervention strategy for each county for different budgets. So this is deciding where to inspect boats, given the primary goal of prevention of spread. So we solve here for the objective to maximize the number of boats inspected through locating inspection stations at lakes to try to capture the most people that might have an infection on their boat that are going to move it to a different lake. So we use a common technique in operations research to identify which lakes we would optimally manage. The next step is then, based on network structure, we calculate common metrics that describe network centrality, including degree, betweenness, centrality, and spectral methods. And that, in invasive species research, these metrics of centrality are shown to do a good job predicting spread in some cases, but they haven't been compared to optimal management or used to guide management. So that's something that we're doing here to try to innovate. So after we can identify the highest centrality lakes using these different metrics, we rank the locations based on the metrics and then place the inspection stations until the budget runs out. And then we evaluate the performance of what we're calling network guided management, basically using heuristics. And we evaluate the performance in terms of the number of potentially infective boats that are inspected. And because these are also situations where we might not be able to do the optimal management, we also introduce another benchmark, which is, how well did these metric guided management rules do compared to just like randomly putting inspection stations on the landscape, which is pretty darn close to the current management, not quite. So finally, given information is a key constraint for effective management in a lot of cases and adds to this challenge of managing large, complex social ecological systems, we assess the performance of these network-based management rules under different information scenarios of ecological data and of the social data on human movement. Sorry, you can probably hear my dog. Our system actually has quite a bit of information, which is unique. So in the extreme case, we actually know the distribution of infected versus uninfected lakes and an estimate of the number of boaters moving between these lakes and also the direction of that movement. So we call this scenario our full information scenario. And in contrast, we can then strip away this information to a more normal scenario where we only have information on the topology of the network. So the presence or absence of a lake, and then the presence, absence of any movement between the lake without any information on whether or not the lake is infected with the zebra mussel and the direction of the movement. And then there's cases in between that we consider that I'm not going to talk about. So first we consider this full information scenario where we know the infection status, the direction of movement, and weighted links. We compare this to the situation with low information, topology only, and then to a situation with randomly placed inspection stations. And here, just as a visual, we have the optimal intervention and the metrics. And then we can look at how the strategies diverge and how the performance of the strategies diverge. And one of the potential advantages of the network approach is if it performs well, it requires less information than an optimization approach would require. Really, you can only apply the optimization in this full information scenario, which is not really something that's realistic in a lot of systems. So for that reason, we introduced the random benchmark so we can compare the metric guided management under the different random scenarios. So I'll show you the results. First, I'm going to show the full information and then the lowest information. So here we have the relative performance of the metrics compared to the optimal, and then also compared to random management, randomly placed inspection stations. And what's really exciting is that the simple network metrics can achieve 99.8% of the optimal performance under full information, which is pretty darn good. And you can see that they're substantially better than management. But what's even more exciting is that when we strip away to topology only, the metrics still do pretty well, pretty darn well. They achieve over 82% of the optimum, much better than random. And this isn't a situation where, just to remind you, with this limited information, you couldn't apply the optimization approach. So we're pretty excited about this result. And the result also held when we used different budgets, and the performance was even better when we had these lower budgets. So in conclusion, for this part of the talk, we found and finding evidence that network structure can provide heuristics that get you pretty darn close to optimal control for biological invasions with less information required. So we're calling this near optimal invasive species management. And these are particularly the contexts that are challenging and challenge our typical management decision tools, because we're often managing in situations with a lot of complexity and low information. The other really exciting result that I don't have time to go into is that we also find that metrics perform better in larger systems. So in these counties with more lakes and more connections between the lakes, the metric performance improves. So we think these findings have a lot of potential for scaling up management guidance to larger scales with more units than can feasibly be done in current optimization approaches. So we want to test this in other contexts, but yeah, I'm excited. So finally, if none of this was your cup of tea, my lab has a lot of other projects going on: adaptive management under climate change, landscape planning for carbon and ecosystem services in Boulder. Both of those are working with land managers and county managers, as well as other work using tools from other disciplines and other topics. So I would just want to throw out there that I'd love to connect with the many great people in your department and exchange ideas and talk about research. So these are just some of the other things going on in my lab. So that's all I have. Thank you to particularly Aislinn and Jamie, who are leading some of the papers that I showed, my other collaborators, and Succinct for funding some of this work. Thanks.
I can't even find like the little clappy icon thing. Thank you, Laura. That was awesome. And does anybody have any questions? I think, oh, there's a, wait. What did I just see? Brian. I'm useless. Oh, there it is. Great talk. I have a little bit of a weird question. And then we can turn to Dan's question. So mine is just like looking across the different case studies that you showed. It struck me that in the Minnesota example, there was one county, like it was one of your first slides, that was like just bad. Like it seemed like whatever disturbance was going on there, it just had a really bad outcome. And it really started making me think about the spatial complexity and component of ecosystem services. And particularly when you then switch to the coastal example, when you were looking at not provisioning services, but things like recreation, it would matter who is getting the service. Like, so it's not the provision, it's not like actually like providing the service, it's getting the service. And I'm wondering if any of your other cases or in these ones where you actually sort of look at the distribution of services and the distribution of people who would benefit or be able to use those services.
Yeah, so that we're trying to get at that with this next step of linking in the coastal case, the food webs to the social networks, so like the beneficiaries. where you might be able to uncover different trade-offs between services indirectly through the food web. Like if, species are eating each other or competing, you might actually have some indirect connection. And then the Minnesota didn't look at the beneficiary side explicitly, but in that map, you did see, even at the county level, that some counties are more affected by others. So there is a lot of spatial heterogeneity in the impacts that could be important. And then we're thinking about that more explicitly now with the work that we're doing with Boulder County, because they care a lot about that, where we're just getting started to model different ecosystem services in the urban and peri-urban environment, and what sort of trade-offs might be happening for different people. So not a totally satisfying answer, but I agree it's really important, and it's work in progress.
Thanks. Maybe I'll switch to Dan. Dan, I'm gonna make this thing where it says allow you to talk.
Danger.
Yeah.
Great, can you hear me?
Because you had a long question.
Hey, Dan.
Hi, Laura.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Great talk. Very cool stuff.
Thanks.
Apparently branched out into all kinds of neat areas.
Had to, being, inland.
True. Cool. Well, I had a quick question about kind of your yes and no result there in terms of, in the forest example, kind of, no relationship between the measurable thing, kind of the ecosystem services, but the yes and the other. And I guess I was wondering to what extent that's kind of a measurement issue, and that in the forest case, right, you're talking about, a fairly visible proxy, which is tree biomass relative to this ecosystem service thing, right? So you've got all the messiness kind of between, those two things there. Whereas in the salt marsh case, you're kind of taking this like very direct concept of robustness and mapping it straight on to ecosystem services. And so I'm wondering, in like a realistic context, like how would one measure robustness in like at the ecosystem level? And do you think that kind of that same really nice, neat relationship would hold if you were, constrained to what you could observe in the real world and not kind of, knowing the robustness of the system? But maybe that's just my lack of field knowledge speaking there.
Yeah, so I didn't show this, and I was looking to see if I had an extra slide on this, but I don't think so. So we actually looked at not only just sort of in aggregate if all the services were retained or not, which is the results I showed you on the robustness, but by service. And so you could track when you would expect particular services to be lost. And that actually varies widely by the service. And so in the field, what we're planning on doing is like looking at historical data as well as a species removal experiment, and then tracking the changes in services and functions. Oh, we lost Dan. So the answer is yes, I think in aggregate robustness might be more closely related, but it does vary a lot by the service and depends on which service.
And then there's a question, let's see, there's timestamps, so I can do in order from Brian Harvey. Maybe I'll go ahead and just allow you to talk, Brian.
Sure, can you hear me?
Hi, yep.
Hey, Laura, awesome talk. Really cool. And I had a question, the first part on the disturbance and ecosystem services was really interesting. And I was curious if you have also looked at cases in that system, or if you're looking at in other systems where disturbances increase the provision, or actually, or in some cases are like critical for the provisioning of ecosystem services. And like an analog that I was thinking about here that we think about is a lot of culturally important plants that are sustained by fire disturbance or things like that. And just curious if you've been looking at that case in some of the Minnesota forests as well, or other areas.
I would love to. I didn't get that far. As Phil pointed out, I didn't start with the background in forests, so even getting there took a while. But now I do have some work with some folks through that succinct group that I mentioned, where we're looking at fire dependent species in Colorado, but more from a conservation lens. But I'd love to follow up with you if you have other ideas and hear more about that case where you are. Sounds super interesting.
Sure. Yeah, that'd be awesome. And yeah, cool talk. Really, really cool stuff. Thanks.
And John, you're up next. If I can.
Hey, Phil. Hi, Laura.
Hi, John.
So I just was curious with your network analysis there, how do you account for external influences like boaters that come from Wisconsin? Because you've got a very discrete network set up in those counties, but you presumably have other boaters coming in from outside of those counties as well, right?
Yeah, so we have just like an aggregate in link that's like all of the ones coming from other counties.
Okay.
Because they do, so this was constructed with boater surveys where they sample and stop the boaters and like understand where they're coming from. So we tried to do that by just thinking about, okay, well, it's just basically a super weighted link from the external, any external county or external place going in, and then similar going out.
So you're not tracking the zebra mussel occurrence in those external areas then?
No,
Okay.
we don't have the data for that. You could extend it to this. And it's something that I had raised, like, even if we had perfect management in Minnesota, what does that mean?
Right, right.
It's not like the species know the boundaries.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you.
I think it's mandatory to have an awkward pause on Zoom.
You're muted.
Well, if there are no more questions, we can call it good. And I'm sure Laura would love if you have questions to communicate with you offline or I guess online. But thanks again, Laura, for a really interesting talk and thought-provoking. I hadn't heard the zebra mussel stuff before, so I'm really curious to dig into that later. So thanks.
Thanks everyone for listening.